September 11th, 1777, Chadds Ford, Brandywine Creek, Pennsylvania. On the morning of September 11th, 1777, an American artillery officer stood above Chadds Ford, watching dark shapes emerge through the mist on the opposite bank of Brandywine Creek. At first came scattered skirmishers, then drums, then columns of red-coated infantry forming beyond musket range. Cannon crews rolled their guns into position. Across the valley, British batteries answered. Every sign pointed to the same conclusion. This was where the main assault would come. It was exactly what General George Washington expected. And it was exactly what General Sir William Howe wanted him to believe. While thousands of American soldiers fixed their eyes on the ford directly ahead, nearly half of the British Army was already disappearing northward on a march that would take them miles away from the battlefield everyone thought they were about to fight. It was one of the longest and riskiest flanking maneuvers of the entire American Revolution. If Washington reacted in time, the British column could be caught while stretched across narrow country roads and shallow river crossings. If he hesitated, the Continental Army would suddenly find an entire enemy army appearing on ground it believed was secure. By sunset, Washington's right flank would collapse. Philadelphia, the revolutionary capital, would lie exposed. Yet the British had not won because they were stronger. They won because they convinced one of history's greatest commanders to spend the most important hours of the battle watching the wrong enemy. How could that happen? To answer that question, we have to begin several weeks before a single musket fired at Brandywine. The summer of 1777 was supposed to end the American Rebellion. London had approved an ambitious strategy. Lieutenant General John Burgoyne would march south from Canada along the Hudson River Valley. Another British army under Sir William Howe would move from New York. If both forces linked together, New England, the heart of the rebellion, would be cut off from the southern colonies. Many British officers believed the war would collapse soon afterward. On paper, it was an elegant plan. In reality, it depended on armies separated by hundreds of miles, moving with perfect timing across forests, rivers, and hostile countryside. Communications across the Atlantic already took weeks. Even messages between British commanders inside America could require days. Every decision carried enormous uncertainty. Howe had another objective in mind. Instead of marching directly toward Burgoyne, he decided to capture Philadelphia, the political center of the Continental Congress. The city itself was not America's largest military depot, nor its strongest fortress, but symbolically, it mattered more than almost anything else. British leaders believed that taking the rebel capital would shatter colonial morale, undermine Congress, and prove that the revolution could not protect even its own government. Washington understood that as well. He knew he could lose forts and recover them. He could abandon countryside and reclaim it later. But surrendering Philadelphia without a serious fight risked convincing both Americans and European observers that the revolution was already failing. That meant he had to stop Howe somewhere between the Chesapeake Bay and Philadelphia. The problem was figuring out where. For weeks, Howe's intentions remained frustratingly unclear. During the summer, the British Army embarked from New York aboard nearly 300 transport and naval vessels, disappearing from Washington's view. No one knew their destination. Rumors spread through American headquarters almost daily. Boston, the Hudson, the Delaware, Charleston. Every report seemed plausible. Every report contradicted another. Washington's cavalry patrols searched desperately for reliable information, but 18th century intelligence was painfully limited. Scouts relied on frightened civilians, intercepted letters, captured deserters, and distant observations of marching columns. None of it painted a complete picture. Then the mystery ended. Late in August, Howe landed roughly 15,000 British and Hessian troops at the head of the Chesapeake Bay, near Head of Elk, in present-day Maryland. His objective had finally become obvious: Philadelphia. Washington immediately moved south. The Continental Army numbered roughly 14,500 men, though not all were seasoned veterans. Valley Forge still lay months ahead, and the Army remained uneven in training and equipment. Yet, it had improved dramatically since the disasters around New York the previous year. Officers had learned painful lessons about retreat, maneuver, and discipline. Washington himself had become far more cautious about risking his army in open battle. That caution shaped every decision he made as Howe advanced north. Rather than attack the British while they marched inland, Washington searched for terrain that would reduce Britain's greatest advantages: disciplined infantry, superior artillery, and battlefield experience. He believed he had found exactly that at Brandywine Creek. The creek formed a natural defensive barrier southwest of Philadelphia. Numerous steep banks protected much of its length, leaving only a handful of practical crossing points known as fords. Among them, Chad's Ford carried the main road toward Philadelphia. If Howe wanted the quickest route, this was the obvious place to attack. Washington deployed accordingly. Major General Nathaniel Greene stood ready to reinforce threatened sectors. General Anthony Wayne held troops near the center. Artillery covered the approaches to Chad's Ford. Other divisions stretched northward to guard additional crossings as best they could. Yet the line extended for nearly 10 miles, far longer than Washington's army could comfortably defend. That weakness worried him. Because every ford the Americans guarded meant another they could not watch closely enough. And before sunrise on September 11th, while Washington concentrated on the crossing he believed mattered most, William Howe had already begun building a battlefield that existed only inside his opponent's mind. Before dawn on September 11th, the British Army split into two very different forces. One of them was meant to be seen. The other was meant to decide the battle. Lieutenant General Wilhelm von Knyphausen, commanding roughly 5,000 British and Hessian troops, received orders that sounded deceptively simple: advance toward Chad's Ford. Deploy aggressively, open artillery fire when appropriate, skirmish with the American line, make every movement look like the opening stages of a full-scale assault. He was not expected to win the battle. He was expected to hold Washington's attention. Meanwhile, nearly 9,000 elite troops under Sir William Howe and Lord Charles Cornwallis quietly marched away from the main road. Their destination lay far to the north, where two lesser-known crossings, Trimble's Ford and Jeffrey's Ford, offered a path around Washington's exposed right flank. The maneuver looked brilliant on a map. On the ground, it bordered on reckless. The column would march nearly 17 miles before striking the American army. Thousands of infantry, artillery pieces, ammunition wagons, supply carts, engineers, cavalry, and camp followers all had to move over narrow Pennsylvania farm roads without creating chaos. Every delay increased the chance that American scouts would discover what was happening. Unlike Napoleon's armies decades later, 18th century forces could not simply spread across highways. Many of these roads barely deserved the name. Some were little wider than wagon tracks winding between stone fences, orchards, forests, and rolling farmland. A single overturned wagon could halt an entire division. A damaged bridge might force hours of delay. And there was another danger Howe could not control: silence. An army of nearly 9,000 men could not actually move silently. Iron-rimmed wheels struck rocks. Horses snorted and stumbled. Officers shouted orders. Muskets clattered against cartridge boxes. Every artillery limber groaned under enormous weight. Dust rose behind the marching columns despite the morning humidity. Someone was going to notice. The entire operation depended on those reports either arriving too late or not being believed. Howe understood something fundamental about 18th century command. Information was rarely absent. It was usually contradictory. The first British soldiers stepped off before sunrise. Cornwallis accompanied the flanking force personally, while Howe remained with it throughout the march instead of directing operations from the safer demonstration at Chad's Ford. That decision alone reveals where he believed the battle would truly be won. Knyphausen's attack was important, but it was only the stage. The flanking column was the performance. As dawn broke, Knyphausen approached the creek exactly as Washington expected. British light infantry appeared opposite Chad's Ford. Hessian Jaegers moved into the woods. Artillery batteries searched for firing positions overlooking the crossing. Then the first cannon spoke. American guns answered almost immediately. Within minutes, smoke drifted across Brandywine Valley as artillery crews on both sides traded ranging shots. Skirmishers exchanged musket fire along the creek. Officers rode continuously behind the American center, delivering reports from one brigade to another. Everything looked exactly like the beginning of a major British assault. Washington watched carefully. He had chosen this ground precisely because Chad's Ford offered Howe the shortest road to Philadelphia. If the British wanted speed, they had to force this crossing. Every visible movement confirmed his reasoning. It was a commander reaching the correct conclusion from incomplete evidence. But several miles north, another story was unfolding. American militia patrols had been sent to observe the lesser crossings beyond the main battlefield. They were not large cavalry screens capable of shadowing an enemy army for hours. Most consisted of local horsemen familiar with the roads, farmers who knew every creek and ridge better than any British officer. One of those patrols suddenly encountered something astonishing. Instead of scattered British detachments, they saw what appeared to be an endless marching column. Infantry, artillery, supply wagons, officers. Thousands of men moving steadily north. The scouts reacted exactly as they were supposed to. Messengers galloped toward Washington's headquarters carrying urgent warnings. The reports began arriving during the morning. General Howe was marching around the American right. For a brief moment, Washington responded decisively. If the intelligence proved accurate, the danger was enormous. He began preparing orders to shift significant forces northward before the British completed their march. Divisions under John Sullivan received instructions to move toward the threatened flank. Then everything changed. New reports arrived. Different scouts insisted the British columns had turned away. Others claimed they had merely observed foraging parties. Still others believed Howe's force had reversed direction entirely and was returning toward Knyphausen. No reconnaissance aircraft existed. No signal stations overlooked the countryside. No telegraph could confirm which messenger had seen what. Each report represented only a tiny fragment of an enormous battlefield. Washington suddenly faced one of the hardest decisions any commander can make. If he stripped troops away from Chad's Ford and the first reports proved false, Knyphausen's waiting force might smash through the weakened center and drive straight toward Philadelphia. If he ignored the warnings and the first reports were correct, the real British army was already marching toward the only part of his line that had almost no time left to prepare. This was no longer a contest of muskets and cannon. It had become a battle over which version of reality Washington would choose to believe. For nearly 2 hours, the Battle of Brandywine existed in two different realities. One reality lay in front of Washington. The other was marching around him. At headquarters near Birmingham Road, officers came and went almost without pause. Couriers arrived coated in dust, handed over hurried reports, then wheeled their exhausted horses around before disappearing again. Maps were unfolded across rough wooden tables. Telescopes scanned distant ridgelines. Staff officers compared one dispatch against another, searching for a pattern that refused to appear. Washington had faced incomplete intelligence before. What made this morning different was that every new report seemed to erase the certainty of the last. One messenger insisted Howe's entire column had crossed the upper fords. Another claimed the British had halted. A third believed they were marching back toward Chad's Ford. None of the reports sounded impossible. That was the real problem. Every one of them could have been true. Unlike modern commanders, Washington had no headquarters capable of tracking units in real time. There were no observation aircraft, no field telegraphs, no radio operators building a common operational picture. Once a scout disappeared beyond the next ridgeline, he effectively vanished until he returned. Hours could pass before information reached headquarters, and by then, an army might already be somewhere else. The British understood that weakness. Howe had not merely hidden his movement. He had hidden it inside the natural confusion of 18th century warfare. Late in the morning, Washington finally received intelligence from one of the officers he trusted most. Colonel Theodoric Bland, commanding elements of the Continental Cavalry, reported significant British movement to the north. Other officers, including Major Spear and local militia observers, independently described large enemy columns advancing toward the upper crossings. For the first time that day, multiple reports appeared to support the same conclusion. Washington acted. He ordered Major General John Sullivan to prepare his division for movement toward the threatened right flank. Additional formations under Lord Stirling and Adam Stephen received warning orders. If Howe truly intended to strike from the north, these troops would form an entirely new defensive line before the British could deploy. It was the correct response. For a few precious minutes, the Continental Army began adapting before the trap closed. Then another courier arrived. This dispatch carried reassuring news. According to fresh intelligence, the British column seen earlier was no longer advancing. Some officers concluded Howe had merely conducted a reconnaissance in force before withdrawing. Others believed American scouts had mistaken dust clouds and scattered detachments for a much larger army. The report sounded convincing enough that Washington paused. Not because he lacked courage, because he understood the cost of moving an army unnecessarily. Shifting thousands of soldiers across unfamiliar roads in the middle of a battle was extraordinarily dangerous. Regiments became separated. Artillery struggled through narrow lanes. Supply wagons blocked intersections. A division caught while marching rather than fighting could be destroyed before it ever formed a line. If Knyphausen attacked Chad's Ford while Sullivan's men were still on the roads, Washington might lose both his center and his right flank simultaneously. He needed certainty. Certainty never came. While American headquarters debated contradictory intelligence, Knyphausen continued playing his role to perfection. British batteries maintained intermittent cannon fire across the creek. Light infantry probed American positions. Hessian Jaegers exchanged shots with riflemen hidden among trees and stone walls. Nothing about the demonstration appeared artificial. In fact, it became increasingly convincing. From Washington's perspective, Knyphausen behaved exactly as a commander preparing for a major assault should behave. His artillery searched for weak points. His infantry gradually increased pressure without committing fully. Every visible action reinforced the belief that Chad's Ford remained the decisive point of the battlefield. This was not theatrical deception. It was disciplined operational design. Knyphausen resisted the temptation to attack too early because his mission was not to seize ground. His mission was to consume Washington's attention. And every minute Washington spent watching Chad's Ford bought Howe another minute to complete the flanking march. Several miles away, Howe's column kept moving. The soldiers had now covered most of their exhausting route. They crossed Trimble's Ford over the west branch of Brandywine, then continued toward Jeffrey's Ford, where they forded the east branch. The maneuver demanded remarkable discipline. Thousands of men crossed without collapsing into confusion, while artillery and wagons negotiated muddy banks that could easily have become bottlenecks. By early afternoon, the hardest part of the operation was over. The British had crossed both branches of the creek. Now they began climbing toward the high ground near Osborne's Hill. The elevation offered something priceless. For the first time that day, Howe could see the American army spread below him. From those heights, British officers looked south across rolling Pennsylvania farmland and immediately recognized what Washington still could not fully confirm. The Continental right flank was dangerously exposed. Howe halted his men briefly. Some historians have questioned why he paused instead of attacking immediately. The answer was practical rather than timid. After marching nearly 17 miles in late summer heat, his troops needed time to close their formations, allow the artillery to catch up, and prepare for a coordinated assault instead of rushing piecemeal into battle. That pause would become one of the most debated moments of Brandywine. Because while the British reorganized, Washington finally received proof that every alarming report from the morning had been true. And by then, the enemy was already looking down on his army. Washington did not need another scout. He needed certainty. Instead, certainty arrived in the worst possible form. Shortly after 2 p.m., officers positioned near the American right reported something they could now see with their own eyes. Across the ridges north of Birmingham Meeting House, sunlight flashed off hundreds of bayonets. Long red lines emerged from behind the hills. Artillery teams hauled cannon into position. British standards appeared above the trees. There was no misunderstanding anymore. Howe had not withdrawn. He had completed the march. The army Washington had been searching for all morning was already deploying on the high ground, overlooking his exposed flank. Everything now depended on speed. Washington reacted immediately. Orders flew across the battlefield. Major General John Sullivan, whose division occupied much of the threatened sector, was instructed to form a new defensive line facing north instead of west. Lord Sterling's division marched toward Birmingham Road. Adam Stevens' Virginians hurried into position to extend the line. Greene remained ready to reinforce wherever the crisis became greatest. The movements were executed with remarkable discipline considering the circumstances. But there was one problem no amount of discipline could solve: time. The British had spent nearly 8 hours choosing the battlefield. The Americans had less than 1 hour to rebuild theirs. Entire brigades changed direction while already on the march. Officers unfamiliar with the ground searched for fences, orchards, and ridgelines that might slow an advancing enemy. Artillery crews struggled to drag heavy guns onto suitable elevations before British batteries opened fire. Every minute mattered. Then another complication appeared. Sullivan's command itself became confused. Earlier that afternoon, Washington had temporarily reorganized portions of the right wing as new intelligence arrived. Divisions shifted responsibilities, brigade boundaries changed, and several officers received revised instructions within a very short period. Under normal conditions, such adjustments were manageable. During an emergency deployment against an army appearing unexpectedly on the flank, they became dangerous. Some regiments halted while waiting for fresh orders. Others marched farther than intended before realizing neighboring units were no longer beside them. Several gaps briefly opened between brigades that had expected different formations to occupy the space next to them. British officers watching from Osborne's Hill could not know every detail unfolding below. They did not need to. They only needed to recognize that the American line was still forming. Howe made one more decision that historians have debated ever since. Instead of attacking immediately after reaching the heights, he waited. To modern readers, that sounds like hesitation. To an 18th century commander, it was often prudence. His men had marched nearly 17 miles under a warm September sun. Units had become stretched across roads and creek crossings. Artillery batteries were still arriving. Ammunition wagons needed to close up. If Howe attacked too quickly, he risked throwing exhausted brigades into combat one after another, instead of striking with the concentrated weight that had made the entire maneuver worthwhile. So he paused. Not long. Just long enough for his army to become a weapon again. Ironically, that delay also gave Washington his final opportunity. Greene's division moved at an astonishing pace. Veterans later recalled covering nearly 4 miles in less than an hour, an extraordinary march for infantry carrying muskets, cartridge boxes, and equipment across uneven Pennsylvania farmland. Greene understood exactly what was happening. If the right flank collapsed before his men arrived, the road toward Philadelphia, and perhaps the Continental Army itself, could unravel. His soldiers pushed forward without stopping. Back near Chad's Ford, however, the illusion continued. Knyphausen never abandoned his role. British guns maintained pressure across the creek. Skirmishers continued exchanging fire. American artillery answered. To soldiers standing along the center, the battle still looked exactly as it had looked all morning. Many had no idea that the decisive fight was about to erupt several miles to their right. This is what made Howe's plan so effective. The demonstration did not have to fool everyone. It only had to keep enough American combat power fixed in place long enough for the real attack to develop. Military theorists today often describe this as fixing the enemy, forcing an opponent to commit forces against one threat while another delivers the decisive blow elsewhere. At Brandywine, that principle unfolded almost perfectly. Washington had correctly identified Chad's Ford as an important crossing. He had correctly recognized that Knyphausen posed a genuine danger. He had even received reports revealing Howe's flanking march. Yet every correct observation competed against another equally believable threat. The British had not hidden reality. They had created two realities at once. Then, at approximately 4 p.m., Howe gave the order he had been carrying since dawn. British infantry stepped forward in long, disciplined lines. Drums rolled across the fields. The flanking march was over. The real battle was finally about to begin. The first British cannon fired from the heights just after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Within seconds, dozens more answered. The long hours of marching, deception, and uncertainty were over. Now the outcome depended on whether Washington's hastily assembled right wing could survive the first impact. Across the rolling fields near Birmingham Meeting House, nearly 9,000 British and Hessian troops advanced in disciplined lines. Howe had organized his force into two powerful wings. On one side marched British Guards, Grenadiers, and line regiments hardened by years of campaigning. On the other, experienced Hessian infantry moved forward with equal precision. Their artillery followed close behind, stopping only long enough to unlimber, fire, and continue advancing. This was exactly the kind of coordinated assault the British Army had spent generations perfecting. Facing them, the American line still carried the scars of the frantic redeployment. General John Sullivan held the critical sector closest to the British advance. Beside him stood divisions under Lord Stirling and Adam Stephen. Individually, these officers were capable commanders. Together, they had barely enough time to establish a continuous front before the attack arrived. Then another problem struck. Sullivan's own division began suffering from confusion created by the rapid changes in command earlier that afternoon. One brigade under General Thomas Conway had been temporarily detached and reassigned before being ordered back again. Another formation misunderstood where it was supposed to deploy. Officers searching for neighboring regiments found open ground instead. Couriers galloped desperately between brigades trying to restore order while British artillery shells burst overhead. The disruption lasted only minutes. But on a battlefield, minutes could determine an entire campaign. Howe saw the hesitation. He increased the pressure immediately. British light infantry surged forward first, driving American skirmishers back through fences and orchards. Behind them came disciplined battalions advancing with remarkable steadiness, despite incoming musket fire. Officers walked behind the ranks with drawn swords, keeping intervals straight while drums maintained the pace. The Americans answered with determined volleys. For a brief moment, the line held. Smoke thickened across the fields until entire regiments disappeared behind drifting white clouds. Soldiers often fired at flashes rather than faces. Commands became difficult to hear over the constant crash of muskets and artillery. Then the British Guards reached effective range. Their volleys struck with devastating precision. Unlike many European armies, British infantry emphasized controlled fire over sheer speed. Officers waited until their men closed the distance before ordering coordinated volleys designed to maximize effect. Entire sections of the American line staggered backward under the impact. Yet they did not collapse. This is one of the most overlooked moments of Brandywine. The Continental Army that faced Howe in September 1777 was no longer the inexperienced force that had broken apart on Long Island the previous year. Many regiments had survived New York, Trenton, Princeton, and months of campaigning. Their officers had learned painful lessons under fire. Instead of disintegrating, many American units conducted organized fighting withdrawals, stopping repeatedly to fire before falling back to the next position. Those few extra minutes mattered enormously. Every delay bought Greene more time. As Sullivan struggled to stabilize the front, Lord Stirling's division anchored portions of the line around Birmingham Meeting House. Veteran Maryland and Delaware troops fought stubbornly from field to field, forcing British battalions to deploy carefully instead of sweeping forward unchecked. The fighting became intensely personal. Stone walls changed hands. Fence lines became temporary fortifications. Small orchards turned into islands of resistance where companies held until ammunition ran low or the enemy threatened to envelop both flanks. Neither side enjoyed clear visibility. Musket smoke drifted so heavily that officers often relied on drumbeats and shouted commands to locate their own regiments. Several American officers later admitted they could barely determine where neighboring brigades were positioned. The battlefield had become a maze. Then the British found the opening they had been searching for. As pressure mounted against Sullivan's division, portions of the American line began pulling back unevenly. Some regiments withdrew in good order. Others held their ground longer, creating dangerous gaps between neighboring units. British officers immediately redirected fresh battalions toward those openings before the Americans could close them. The advantage Howe had spent the entire day creating finally began paying dividends. This was never about overwhelming Washington with numbers alone. It was about forcing him to fight while still reorganizing. Every gap that appeared existed because the British had dictated the timing of the battle. Washington recognized the danger almost immediately. Riding close to the fighting, he watched the right wing bend under mounting pressure. Reports arriving from different sectors painted the same picture. Individual regiments were fighting well, but the line as a whole was slowly being compressed. If it broke completely, the road behind the American army would lie open. At that exact moment, a new column appeared on the battlefield. Dust rose along the roads behind the American position. After one of the fastest marches of the entire campaign, Nathaniel Greene's division was finally arriving. And its arrival would prevent Brandywine from becoming something far worse than a defeat. By late afternoon, the Battle of Brandywine had reached the point where victories and disasters are separated by minutes rather than miles. Washington's right wing was giving ground, but it was not breaking. That distinction mattered. General Nathaniel Greene arrived just as the situation threatened to spiral out of control. His division had covered nearly 4 miles at extraordinary speed, reaching the battlefield tired but still organized. Greene wasted almost no time assessing the situation. Instead of trying to restore the original line, which was already impossible, he focused on something more realistic. He would buy Washington enough time to save the army. Greene positioned his regiments along the roads leading toward Dilworthtown, using the rolling hills and scattered farms to shorten the American front. The ground naturally forced British units to compress as they advanced, reducing some of the numerical advantage Howe had created through his flanking maneuver. It was exactly the kind of decision an experienced commander makes under pressure. You stop trying to win the battle. You start preventing the battle from becoming irreversible. As Greene's men formed, British infantry pressed forward again. The Guards advanced with remarkable discipline, despite hours of marching and continuous combat. Hessian battalions maintained pressure on the American left within the new defensive line, while British artillery steadily shifted closer, firing whenever clear fields of fire appeared through the smoke. The fighting around Dilworth became some of the hardest of the entire day. American regiments fired from behind fences, stone walls, and small rises in the ground before withdrawing in controlled stages. Officers repeatedly ordered their men to hold until the last practical moment, then fall back before British bayonets reached them. Every position delayed Howe only briefly. But every delay forced the British to stop, dress their ranks, bring forward artillery, and begin again. Those repeated interruptions gradually consumed the advantage Howe had gained through surprise. This is one of the reasons Brandywine deserves far more attention than it usually receives. The British deception worked almost exactly as planned. The flanking march succeeded. Washington reacted too late. The American right flank was turned. Yet the Continental Army still refused to collapse. Greene's disciplined withdrawal transformed what could have become another Long Island into something entirely different. Washington himself remained dangerously close to the fighting. Several witnesses later described him riding calmly between formations while musket balls passed nearby. Like many 18th century commanders, he believed visibility mattered. Soldiers who saw their commander staying on the field were less likely to panic. His presence could not reverse the tactical situation, but it helped preserve order. Then Howe encountered a problem he had hoped to avoid all day: darkness. It was already late September. The sun was beginning to sink, and every passing minute reduced visibility across fields now covered by smoke from thousands of muskets and dozens of cannon. Pursuing a retreating army under those conditions carried enormous risks. Units became separated. Friendly formations could mistake one another for the enemy. Officers lost control once the light disappeared. Howe continued pressing forward. But the rapid destruction of Washington's army, the decisive result London wanted, was slipping away. Then another phase of the British plan finally began. For nearly the entire battle, Lieutenant General Wilhelm von Knyphausen had waited opposite Chad's Ford, maintaining constant pressure without committing his entire force. Now he knew the signal had come. The American right had been driven back. Washington was fully engaged to the north. The moment for the demonstration had ended. Knyphausen ordered a genuine assault across the creek. British and Hessian troops crossed at Chad's Ford, forcing back the American units that had defended the crossing since morning. General Anthony Wayne, who had spent most of the day expecting this attack to become the main battle, suddenly found himself fighting a difficult rearguard action instead. For Wayne's soldiers, the realization must have been brutal. The attack they had prepared to stop all day had never been the real attack. It had been the lock holding them in place while Howe struck elsewhere. Even so, Wayne's troops did not disintegrate. They withdrew steadily, contesting roads and delaying Knyphausen's advance long enough for the rest of the Continental Army to continue its retreat. By early evening, both British columns were finally converging. This had always been Howe's objective. Not two separate battles, one synchronized blow. The flanking force would drive Washington backward. Knyphausen's advance would prevent him from simply falling back into his original positions. From a tactical perspective, it was an impressive demonstration of operational coordination. From a strategic perspective, it still fell short of complete success, because despite losing the field, despite surrendering the roads toward Philadelphia, despite being outmaneuvered by one of the finest armies in the world, George Washington's army was still marching away together. The British had won the battle, but the army they needed to destroy was still alive. And that single fact would change everything that happened next. As darkness settled over southeastern Pennsylvania on September 11, 1777, the firing gradually faded. The Battle of Brandywine was over. The British held the field. The road to Philadelphia lay open. On paper, it looked like another decisive victory for the British Army. In reality, the result was far more complicated. Washington's army withdrew toward Chester in remarkably good order. Despite being struck on the flank by nearly 9,000 men, despite enduring simultaneous pressure from Knyphausen at Chad's Ford, and despite fighting for hours while constantly repositioning, the Continental Army had not dissolved into a rout. That was no small achievement. British commanders estimated American losses at roughly 1,100 to 1,300 men killed, wounded, and captured. British and Hessian casualties totaled just under 600. It was a clear tactical victory, but not the decisive victory Howe had hoped for. That distinction would haunt the rest of the campaign. Throughout 18th century warfare, winning battles was often less important than destroying armies. Cities could be occupied, forts could be captured. Supply depots could be rebuilt, but an experienced field army, especially one held together by capable officers, was far harder to replace. Howe had outmaneuvered Washington. He had not eliminated him. Within days, the British entered Philadelphia, forcing the Continental Congress to flee westward. Newspapers across the empire celebrated the occupation of the rebel capital. To many observers in London, it appeared that the revolution was entering its final stage. Yet Washington refused to accept that losing Philadelphia meant losing the war. Only 5 days later, on September 16th, he turned to face Howe once again near Malvern. A violent rainstorm soaked both armies before the battle could develop. Powder became useless, roads turned into mud. The engagement dissolved almost before it began in what historians now call the Battle of the Clouds. Washington escaped again. Then, in early October, he launched another bold attempt to strike Howe at Germantown. That attack ultimately failed, but it revealed something important. The Continental Army was still capable of taking the offensive. Brandywine had not broken its will. Meanwhile, events hundreds of miles to the north were unfolding in ways Howe could no longer influence. While the British commander marched into Philadelphia, General John Burgoyne continued advancing south from Canada exactly as the original British strategy had envisioned. He expected Howe to cooperate. Help never arrived. Cut off, increasingly isolated, and surrounded by growing American forces, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army at Saratoga on October 17, 1777. The surrender shocked Europe. Until that moment, many foreign governments had viewed the American rebellion as a dangerous but temporary colonial uprising. Saratoga changed everything. France concluded that the United States had a realistic chance of surviving. In 1778, the French formally entered the war. Money, weapons, soldiers, warships. The conflict was no longer a colonial rebellion. It had become a global war against the British Empire. Ironically, one of Britain's finest battlefield victories helped create the conditions for one of its greatest strategic defeats. And that brings us back to the question we asked at the very beginning. How did the British fool George Washington? Not through luck. Not because American scouts failed to do their jobs, and certainly not because Washington lacked military ability. The real weapon at Brandywine was time. Knyphausen's demonstration never needed to break the American center. It only needed to force Washington to keep asking one question. Is this the real attack? Every artillery exchange across Chad's Ford, every probing movement by British light infantry, every Hessian battalion visible across the creek, every contradictory intelligence report. Each one consumed another few minutes. Those minutes became hours. Those hours allowed Howe's column to complete a 17-mile march, cross 2 fords, occupy Osborne's Hill, reorganize an exhausted army, and launch its assault against an unprepared flank. The deception worked because it attacked the commander's decision-making process rather than his soldiers. Military academies still teach versions of the same principle today. Fix the enemy's attention. Create uncertainty. Force decisions before reliable information exists. Then strike where those decisions leave him weakest. That was the true victory at Brandywine. Not the flanking march itself, but the carefully engineered illusion that convinced an experienced commander to spend the decisive hours preparing for yesterday's battle instead of today's. Yet history also remembers something else. Despite one of the most sophisticated operational deceptions of the Revolutionary War, despite losing both the battlefield and the American capital, George Washington preserved the one thing Britain could never afford to let escape: his army. And as long as that army remained in the field, the revolution remained alive. If you enjoyed this breakdown of the military mechanics behind Brandywine and want more stories that explain how battles were actually won, not just who won them, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue creating deeply researched documentaries like this one. And now we'd love to hear your opinion. What was the decisive factor at Brandywine? The brilliance of Howe's deception, the limitations of 18th century intelligence, or Washington's unavoidable caution? And where in the world are you watching from today?